Before the pandemic, I went back to my native soil, to Colorado, to visit some family. I was about an hour early to one of the family parties, so I decided to stop off at a park where I used to skateboard. And in that park, there was a part of it I had never seen. It was like a huge mound or hill, and I walked around to the other side, and I saw a ring of stones with words carved into them and a memorial of names on the walls behind. This area was designed to cut the noise from the surrounding park, and it was empty and quiet. And at the entrance, there was a placard that read, "I hope people come to this place to think about how they themselves can be better people, rather than come here and reflect on death." And it was attributed to a parent. No name, just a parent. It was the memorial for the mass shooting that took place at the Columbine High School in the late 90s. And each of the murdered children and teacher had a stone tablet with words carved into the surface from their family. The entire park was designed by members of the Columbine community. The materials were sourced from the region so that the memorial nestled into the surroundings perfectly. The families were given a blank slate with which to write their message. Some families addressed their children directly. Others put quotes from their children's diaries or poetry. It is a peaceful place. It is a sacred place. There is grief and sorrow and joy and anger that ring that place. There were images of darkness and of light, of soaring and dark tunnels of the soul. And notably absent was any reference to the weapons that made the murders possible. One of the stone tablets directly addresses the sins of society. It talks about a godless school and a country that allows abortions in hot, grieving anger. But not one mention of guns and a society that loves them so much. And I point to this fact not to take away from the power of the memorial. Grief of this magnitude is just to be witnessed to. It's not to be argued with. We don't make policy from grief alone and think goodness because that is too much of a burden for grief to shoulder. I bring this up, though, because the absence of any reference to guns made their presence all the more there. And so I sat in that peaceful place and I reflected. See, because I grew up in the heart of gun country, rural Colorado. Most folks my family knew, proudly owned guns. And I'm not talking about hunting rifles and handguns. I'm talking about assault rifles and the tactical military-grade weapons. For the most part, I knew these folks as my friends and my family. And I know we often think of the proverbial gun nut and we form an image in our mind, and I know you all have that image. But throughout my early life, guns were simply a part of the world. They were not discharged objects filled with ideas of individual rights or terror or destruction. They were like a kitchen knife or the shovels outside. I simply wasn't interested in them. Sure, my family would go out shooting and I would go out shooting with them, but I was more likely to be found gathering rocks for my rock collection. And to this day, my brother and my father continue to be gun enthusiasts. My father's taste has migrated into the historical, my brother's into sport shooting. And all during that time and to today, there was the unending debates about gun violence and gun rights. And some of the terms have changed. Some of the tactics are different, but the debate essentially has remained unchanged since that time. And in the Colorado that I grew up in the Colorado of Columbine, it was just impolite to bring up guns. It only led to bitterness if you disagreed, and if you agreed, you probably knew it. Colorado is just a strange purple state like that. And when I moved to New York, I realized that my family's passion for guns was like deeper than a mere hobby. Their first reaction to my move was fretting about how I wouldn't be able to own guns in New York City. It was much like my aversion to any place that was seemingly hostile to queer people. My family was just horrified at the thought of leaving one's guns behind. The so-called debate about gun control and gun rights is not often had in good faith. We all know the cycle. We have seen it before over and over and over. A mass shooting event occurs, outrage, talks about mental health, slow walking and debating, intense statements made in support of guns, debating more talk about mental health, and then everything fizzles out and an exhausted society limps along to its next massacre. Now, anytime as a society we fail to change in rational, self-preserving ways, any time that we fail to truly safeguard our children with what are seemingly rational and self-apparent steps, we should pause, reflect, and listen. Not to the nonsense fake arguments put forward to distract not only ourselves but themselves. I'm talking about the outrageous arguments that we need more guns, not less, or arm every teacher, or if we only had better mental health care, everything would be okay. I'm not talking about the fake debates between infringed or well-regulated. These are all proxies for the underlying argument that is happening. Too often we can get sucked into the belief that this tragedy is the one that will open people's eyes, get them to move politicians to draft meaningful litigation and to begin to solve this problem. Tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and we still hold out hope that this is the one that will change everything. But just like the climate crisis, we don't need more evidence. We're not lacking in proof or in the ability to expose the truth. It's there for everyone to see, and the so-called debate has just calcified into practiced tropes. And just like the climate crisis, we can too get caught up in being right. Calling it a debate implies that two people present their case and that there is a possibility that one could prove to the other or even sway the other just slightly that they are right. And too often this fixation on being right, of having evidence, of being rational, of being popular, blinds us to the task at hand. It's not enough to be right. Our society is filled with risks, and we assess risks and make choices. We know for a fact that every year, thousands of people will die in car accidents, and we calculate that the risk of accidental death is worth the benefits of living in a car-driven society. Even if we don't vote on it or even consciously think about it, we do it. We calculate the benefit of our individual freedom to go where we please, when we please, as a risk worth taking. We calculate the benefit of having goods delivered directly to our homes as a fair exchange for the risk we have calculated. And now we are doing that with COVID every day. When we fail to meaningfully regulate the sale, possession, and use of firearms, we must understand that what the calculus is of the risk and benefit that makes this possible. We know the risk. Beyond mass shootings, beyond domestic violence, beyond suicide, is the culture of violence that we know so well. But what is so important to this culture that these tragedies are worth it? Deep in the soul of America is the frontier, and the frontier is the culture of violence. At its heart, the frontier is the place where society meets the wild, where the unexplored becomes the explored, where the viscerality of life and death is felt in each waking moment. Frontier culture emerges in so many places in our collective imagination. Shows like The Walking Dead, where a zombie apocalypse reduces us to a small group of individuals making violent and visceral decisions to reestablish society. Or even the fantasy of the open road, just you and your car driving into the unknown. Frontier culture tells us at once that we have power, that you as an individual can determine the path of your life, and it tells you that you are alone and are responsible for your well-being. It tells you that around the corner is the real and the palpable, not an anesthetized version of life that modern society holds. Now, we often make fun of gun enthusiasts for their loud noises and bangs, and I think there is a truth embedded in that we are often removed from the palpability of life. We don't see where our food comes from. Death is often shrouded behind hospital doors. As our world is more safe, we fantasize about a dangerous world. And what better symbolizes the frontier than a gun? And paradoxically, the more unsafe society is because of the widespread ownership and use of guns, the more attractive they become in the logic of the frontier. This world is dangerous. Only you can protect yourself. And I say all this because all of us have a fragment of the frontier mentality in us. The American Revolution is a story of the frontier, when people took up arms against a hostile foreign power to secure the dream of liberty. The freedom fighting in Ukraine is a frontier story. The inner work we need to do is to examine ourselves and to find these threads of the frontier in our heart and examine them and ask it, what work does it do for us? Does it make us better friends? Does it make us love each other more? Does it help with the work of justice? The frontier is alluring and self-destructive. We should ask, is there another way to access the viscerality of life? And I don't want to get this wrong. The logic of the frontier is an easy friend of white supremacy, of patriarchy, and of the logic of genocide. This idea of the thin blue line, the belief that there is a criminal world and a civilized world, and that the divide between them is maintained solely by the presence of an armed force in society, is the logic of the frontier. And when people say gun rights are fundamental rights, we should ask, for whom? When Philando Castile, a black man, was murdered by a police officer in front of his girlfriend's daughter for owning a legal firearm, the NRA was silent. When gun rights activists talk about criminals and mental illness, the language is so often so thinly veiled as to appear to be only a mild gloss. The logic of the frontier is one of settling by violent means the wild. And the wild is often a cipher. It is a cipher for the Native American, for the immigrant, for the criminal, for those living with mental illness, for the non-white, for the non-Christian. In a book edited and introduced by Cornel West, it's called The Radical King, West traces the radical elements of Martin Luther King Jr.'s thoughts and actions. Too often, West claims, King is whitewashed and sanitized so as to make him palpable for the American public. But I want to quote West here talking about King. He said, King's dream of a more free and democratic America and world had morphed into, in his words, a nightmare, owing to the persistence of racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. He called America a sick society. At one point, King cried out in despair, I have found out that all I have been doing to correct this system in America has been in vain. I am trying to get to the roots of it to see what ought to be done. The whole thing will have to be done away with. He said to his dear brother, Harry Belafonte, days before his, King's, death. Are we integrating into a burning house? Racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. These are America's nightmare. These are the legacy of the logic of the frontier. Racism, poverty, militarism, materialism. These are all legible in gun culture, but that culture is a distillation of an American culture steeped in that logic of the frontier. We will not have a reasonable gun policy until we have confronted the frontier logic in our society, in ourselves and in our neighbors. And I'm not saying we should give up the fight for a rational policy regarding guns. We can do both, just like we can be pro-choice and recognize that the heart of anti-choice policies is corrosive patriarchy that eats away at the heart of our society. Keep advocating, keep doing the good and necessary work. And also recognize that being right is not enough if we do not dig down into the roots and find a life-giving story to combat the violent story of the frontiers. In our reading today, Benjamin describes the angel of history as watching the past, not as a chain of events, but as one catastrophe with ever-piling wreckage. It's hard to find a better description of the series of violent mass shootings that we see year after year after year. There is no story arc. There is no superhero plotline, just one single catastrophe with wreckage continuously piling up. Benjamin tells us that the angel would like to stay, to awaken the dead, and to make whole what has been smashed. And the Tao calls this the small, dark light. The soft, the weak prevail over the hard and the strong. Frontier justice, frontier logic seeks frontier justice, revenge, and the reassertion of power, control, and strength. The angel of history, the small, dark light reminds us that that logic always self-destructs. Our journey must be one that seeks to make whole what has been smashed.